What do we mean when we talk about data and voice? In this video, we will reflect upon what we mean when we talk about data and voice. We will hear from Professor Elaine Sharland from the University of Sussex research team, who examines what we mean when we talk about voice, data, and information. Some of the key talking points include the multiple voices that we need to capture and pay attention to, the complexity around recognising voice, and definitions of information as both qualitative and quantitative.
When we're talking and thinking about voice, certainly we've done quite a lot of work and had quite a lot of conversations around what we mean by voice within certainly the Children's Information Project. And this is really, here's our kind of the point we've arrived at, both as a starting point, and we've developed our thinking as we've gone along. But we're first of all, when we're thinking about voice, we're really mindful that in the whole field of working with generating and using children's information, there are multiple voices involved in that, multiple voices that we feel it's important to capture and to pay attention to. So obviously, children's voices, young people's voices, parents and carers' voices, but also practitioners' voices. We're interested in where they appear, probably less than we might hope, as well as the voices of managers, policymakers, and wider community members. One of our sort of starting points has been thinking that, very often in the kinds of data that we collect about children and formally report, for example, to the DFE, there is, although it's tacit, it's very much kind of, if you like, the DFEs or policymakers' voices that are in there that determine what on earth it is that is considered important to collect and record and gather and work with. And that's not necessarily guided by what, for example, children and families might think are important. So a whole range of voices we're interested to look at and keen to kind of work with. And of course, diversity of voices within those groups. There's no sense in which we can expect, if we use the word voice in a singular, it sort of implies, all children, all young people may have the same voice. Of course, they will have very different voices depending on their own selves and their own experiences. We're also interested in how voices appear within and about children's information at individual levels, let's say within their case records, but also at more aggregate and collective levels. So the multiple voices are definitely key to our thinking about embedding voice within children's information. We're also, as a project, interested in how voice appears as information. In other words, how views, let's say children, young people's parents, families, practitioners' views, experiences and feelings about their experiences appear within the information that we collect and use about them. So that's their voices actually as information that we will handle and use, as well as voices about information. We're really interested, and this is something that we think is much less worked with than, as far as we've seen so far, than perhaps it might be, in really working with people's voices about children's information, about what information is gathered about them, about how it's used, who it's shared with, how it's shared with, how it's used. And the other thing to say is that throughout this project, as far as we can, we want to recognise that voices and voice are complex. Voice isn't just something that gets expressed through a survey or through an audit process or what have you, but voices can actually be implicitly expressed as well as explicitly. Some of them are much more hidden, some of them much more accessible than others. Voice, particularly say with young children, or those who, for whatever reasons, don't feel able to speak out, can be expressed non-verbally as well as verbally. We can consider voices to be actually sensible ones or challenging ones. They may occur spontaneously, or they may be invited in some formal way. We do see voice as something that is expressed in relationship, in situations, in contexts, and what I say and express today, this morning, in this context, in this webinar, may be different from what I might say in another context or express this afternoon in some other. As I say, individual and collective voices, and we're also obviously interested in whether and how voices actually become heard and listened to, whether operationally or strategically. So it's a fairly complex, inclusive way of approaching voice that we hope you'll share with us and join with us in thinking about. The other thing is just to say a little bit about what we mean when we talk about children's information, and actually what we mean when we talk about children's data. And we've, I think it's fair to say, we've had a lot of conversation within the Children's Information Project about this, recognising as these speech bubbles on the left-hand side of that slide show that those expressions, information and data, mean very different things to different people. So both among ourselves and among the colleagues, that we've spoken to in our local authority sites, we're working with 4 main local authority sites on the project, as well as a wider learning network that RIP are convening as part of the project to discuss our issues more broadly. But we've identified that some people, for example, think of the word data as meaning something quantitative, statistical data, something that can be analysed statistically, whereas others, and particularly some of the sort of frontline practitioners we've spoken to, actually see data as something that can be quantitative or it can be qualitative, and there are many ways that you can analyse and use it. And similarly, we've had debates amongst ourselves and with people that we've spoken to about what's the distinction between information and data. Some people see information as the stuff that is around us everywhere, but that it only becomes something we call data when we decide it's important to choose, to select, to record, to codify in some way. That's when information becomes data. And coming at it the other way, some of us and some people we've spoken to feel that data is what surrounds us everywhere, but it only becomes information when we start to interpret, analyse and be informed by it. So there's quite a complexity of use of these terms. The way we're handling this within our conversations is we're using information really in the most inclusive way possible as an umbrella term that basically denotes everything that might be important to know and important to think about and consider about children, young people and their families, whether as individuals, whether as groups, in order to improve their lives. And so that includes information that is formally gathered and reported as data in, say, your local authority administrative data sets and in national returns to government, but it also includes all the other kinds of information, for example, that sits in case records, that isn't necessarily codified or collated in any other way or integrated in administrative data sets, and that may or may not get called data. So information, we mean everything, whatever label you choose within that to call it, everything that may be important to know about children and their families and circumstances.
Here are some reflective questions for you to consider. Consider examples from your own organisation and practice. How does your conception of data, information and voice shape the way that you work with people with lived experience of social care? Do your definitions of information and voice align with your organisation's definitions?